Few executions in history have left a deeper and more lasting mark on humanity than the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Taking place in the 1st century under Roman rule, crucifixion was a punishment specifically designed to prolong suffering while serving as a brutal public warning. Jesus, accused of treason and blasphemy, was condemned to death by Pontius Pilate, even though many accounts suggest Pilate himself doubted his guilt. Forced to carry his own cross through the streets of Jerusalem to Golgotha, Jesus endured public humiliation, physical exhaustion, and repeated mockery before being nailed to the cross. The method itself was one of the most agonizing ever devised. Victims often lingered for hours or days, their lungs collapsing under the weight of their own bodies as they slowly suffocated. For Jesus, the torment was compounded by a crown of thorns, verbal abuse from the crowd, and the soldiers casting lots for his clothes. Crucifixion wasn't simply execution, it was a form of psychological warfare on the public. What makes this particular death haunting is not only the cruelty, but also the immense ripple effect it left behind. The crucifixion became the foundation of Christianity, transforming a barbaric punishment into a symbol of sacrifice, redemption, and eternal hope. For billions of believers, the cross is a sacred emblem, yet it also remains a reminder of one of the most brutal methods of capital punishment ever inflicted by humankind. Even today, the crucifixion of Jesus resonates far beyond religion. It is studied by historians, debated by theologians, and remembered by cultures worldwide. This execution stands as one of the most infamous state-sanctioned killings in history. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, met one of the most infamous and tragic ends on Tower Green. Once the most powerful woman in England, Anne's meteoric rise to queenship ended in betrayal and death. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges most historians now agree were fabricated to remove her from the throne and make way for Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour. The trial was swift, orchestrated, and designed for one outcome: Anne's elimination. Anne's execution was different from most others of her time. Instead of the usual axe, Henry ordered a skilled French swordsman to perform the beheading, ensuring a swift and precise death. Clad in a simple gown, Anne displayed remarkable composure, delivering a dignified final speech that avoided criticism of the king. She knelt, and with a single stroke of the sword, her life was cut short. Her body was hastily buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower of London, a grim end for a queen who had once reshaped England's destiny. The spectacle of her death shocked England and Europe alike. Anne had been instrumental in one of the most dramatic shifts in English history, the break from the Catholic Church and the birth of the Church of England. Yet her downfall revealed the volatility of Tudor politics, where loyalty was fleeting and power was perilous. Even queens were not immune to betrayal, jealousy, and political maneuvering. Her death remains haunting because of its cold efficiency and the swiftness of her fall from grace. Once celebrated as a queen who altered history, Anne Boleyn became a stark reminder of how fragile power truly was in Henry's court. Her story continues to captivate the world, symbolizing both the dangers of unchecked ambition and the cruel fates often faced by those who stood too close to power. Joan of Arc, the teenage peasant girl who claimed divine visions and led French forces to crucial victories, met one of the most horrific ends in history at just 19 years old. Captured by the English and their allies during the 100 Years' War, she was brought to trial for heresy, witchcraft, and even cross-dressing, a charge based on her wearing male military clothing. In truth, the trial was less about religion and more about silencing a powerful symbol of French resistance. Despite her courage and steadfast declarations of divine guidance, the verdict was predetermined. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was burned alive in the marketplace of Rouen. Bound tightly to a stake, she faced a roaring fire while a jeering crowd gathered to witness her torment. Eyewitnesses reported her cries rising above the flames and noted her unwavering calls to God even in her final moments. When the fire finally subsided, her remains were reduced to ashes, which were then scattered into the Seine River to prevent her supporters from collecting relics. What makes Joan's execution especially haunting is the sheer injustice behind it. Rising from obscurity, she had changed the course of a war and given hope to a nation, only to be betrayed and silenced in the most excruciating way possible. Her death was meant to destroy her influence, yet instead, it magnified her legacy. Within decades, the Catholic Church declared her trial invalid, and centuries later, she was canonized as a saint, cementing her place as one of the most revered figures in Christian history. Joan of Arc's burning wasn't just an execution, it was a political statement and an attempt to extinguish a symbol of hope. To this day, her name resonates as a powerful emblem of faith, resilience, and the unyielding strength of conviction in the face of persecution. When the French Revolution erupted in the late 18th century, the guillotine became its most chilling symbol, designed to be a swift and supposedly humane method of execution. But in practice, it became the face of terror, with thousands executed in public squares under its blade. Introduced in 1792, the guillotine's efficiency was unmatched. Victims were lined up, their identities announced to the crowd, and within seconds, the blade dropped with a sickening finality. It quickly became a tool not just of justice, but of mass political purges. Figures like Marie Antoinette, Georges Danton, and Maximilien Robespierre all met their fate beneath its sharp edge. The spectacle itself drew massive crowds. For many Parisians, executions became a form of entertainment, complete with vendors selling food and pamphlets as heads rolled into baskets. This normalization of death reflected the volatile and bloody atmosphere of the Reign of Terror, when suspicion and accusations could mean a quick trip to the scaffold. Though the guillotine was used in France well into the 20th century, its image is forever tied to the revolution. To this day, it stands as one of history's most haunting reminders of how ideals of liberty and equality can turn into ruthless violence when consumed by fear and extremism. On December 30, 2006, former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein was executed by hanging, closing one of the darkest chapters in modern Middle Eastern history. After decades of ruling Iraq through fear, brutality, and mass killings, Saddam was captured by U.S. forces in 2003. His trial, widely televised, ended with a conviction for crimes against humanity, particularly the killing of 148 Shia villagers in Dujail in 1982. The execution itself was swift but controversial. Saddam was led to the gallows in Baghdad and given little time for final words before the noose was placed around his neck. With a sudden drop, his life ended. However, leaked cell phone footage of the hanging spread globally, showing taunts from guards and chaotic scenes. Reactions to his death were divided. For many Iraqis, particularly those who had suffered under his regime, it was a moment of closure. Yet others criticized the execution's mishandling, arguing that it further fueled sectarian divides and undermined stability in the region. Internationally, human rights groups questioned the fairness of the trial and the use of capital punishment in such a politically charged case. Saddam's hanging remains haunting not only because of who he was, but because of what it symbolized: a violent end to a violent era, captured on shaky footage and shared with the world in real time. In the summer of 1918, the centuries-old Romanov dynasty came to a brutal and tragic end. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children had been held captive after the Russian Revolution forced the abdication of the throne. In the early hours of July 17th, Bolshevik guards led the family and their loyal servants into a basement in Yekaterinburg under the pretense of relocation. Without warning, the guards opened fire. The room filled with chaos. Bullets ricocheted off hidden jewels sewn into the daughter's clothing, prolonging the massacre. After the initial volley, bayonets and gunshots were used to finish the grim task. Within minutes, the entire family and their attendants lay dead, their bodies hastily buried in unmarked graves. The execution shocked the world. For centuries, the Romanovs had symbolized Imperial Russia, and their violent end marked the definitive break from monarchy to communist rule. For many Russians, it was not just the death of a family, but the death of an entire era of tradition and faith. To this day, the Romanovs' execution remains one of history's most infamous assassinations. In the decades that followed, rumors persisted that one or more of the children had survived. The eventual discovery and DNA identification of the remains in the late 20th century finally confirmed the tragic truth, but the haunting legacy of that night still echoes in Russian history. The late 17th century saw hysteria grip Salem, Massachusetts, where fear of witchcraft led to one of the most infamous episodes in colonial America. Between 1692 and 1693, more than 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft, a crime punishable by death. The trials were fueled by paranoia, religious fervor, and personal vendettas, with little room for rational defense. Those accused faced impossible choices: confess to witchcraft and live in disgrace, or maintain innocence and risk execution. 19 people, mostly women, were hanged on Gallows Hill. Another man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones after refusing to enter a plea. The executions drew large crowds, turning the ordeal into a macabre public spectacle. The methods were brutal, and the victims often faced torment even before reaching the gallows, locked in filthy prisons for months. What makes these executions especially haunting is that they were based largely on fear and fabricated evidence. Spectral testimony claims that spirits of the accused tormented the victims was accepted as fact in court. Today, the Salem witch trials remain a cautionary tale. They expose the dangers of hysteria and scapegoating, showing how fear can turn entire communities against the innocent. The haunting legacy of these deaths lies not just in the loss of life, but in the warning they provide about human cruelty under the guise of righteousness. Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler, earned his reputation as one of history's most ruthless rulers through executions that terrified even his enemies. Living in the 15th century, Vlad sought to defend his territory against the Ottoman Empire and consolidate power at home. His preferred method of punishment was impalement, driving a wooden stake through the body and leaving the victim to die slowly in public view. It's estimated that tens of thousands perished under Vlad's reign, their bodies displayed on stakes as warnings to others. Entire fields of impaled victims were left rotting under the sun. Accounts describe forests of corpses lining roadsides, a deliberate strategy to instill horror and ensure obedience. While some Romanians view Vlad as a national hero who resisted foreign domination, his cruelty is impossible to ignore. His atrocities went beyond wartime necessity. Executions often targeted not just enemies, but also peasants, nobles, and anyone he suspected of betrayal. The psychological terror he unleashed made him infamous across Europe. Vlad's reputation would later inspire Bram Stoker's fictional character, Count Dracula. His executions were not just punishments, they were theater, designed to etch fear deep into the hearts of all who heard his name. The electric chair, introduced in the late 19th century, was hailed as a more humane alternative to hanging. Instead, it became infamous for some of the most haunting executions in American history. The first use was in 1890, when William Kemmler was strapped into the chair in New York. But the execution went horribly wrong. Kemmler did not die instantly. Instead, he suffered through 2 rounds of current, with witnesses horrified at the gruesome spectacle. Throughout the 20th century, the electric chair was used widely in the United States, and it often drew controversy for botched executions. Some of the most famous cases include the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1953, convicted of espionage during the Cold War. Their deaths were highly publicized and remain debated to this day, with many questioning the fairness of their trial. Other cases, such as the execution of Ted Bundy in 1989, attracted worldwide attention, cementing the electric chair as a symbol of American justice and controversy. While the electric chair has largely been replaced by lethal injection, its legacy remains deeply unsettling. Far from being the clean, efficient method it was intended to be, it became a grim reminder of how difficult it is to make state-sanctioned death anything less than horrifying. The story of Grigory Rasputin's assassins is almost as bizarre as the mystic's life. When Rasputin was finally murdered in 1916, those responsible were aristocrats and political insiders who viewed him as a threat to Russia's monarchy. But after the Bolshevik Revolution, retribution loomed large. Many of those linked to his death would later face their own executions. In a cruel twist of irony, some were subjected to hanging. These hangings were carried out not just as punishment, but as spectacle. The public humiliation of Rasputin's killers was meant to send a chilling message. The new order would not forgive or forget those who had tampered with power. What makes these deaths so haunting is their eerie symmetry. Just as Rasputin famously survived poison and gunshots before finally succumbing, his assassins endured multiple failed methods before death claimed them. Their fate reminds us that executions, especially during times of political upheaval, often served less as justice and more as brutal theater. In this case, vengeance blurred the line between punishment and cruelty. In January 1793, King Louis XVI of France became one of the most famous victims of the guillotine during the French Revolution. Once the absolute monarch of a grand European kingdom, he was reduced to a trembling prisoner in Paris as revolutionaries sought to dismantle centuries of royal dominance. His trial for treason sealed his fate, and a unanimous vote declared that the king must die. On January 24, Louis was brought to the guillotine at the Place de la Révolution. Witnesses recorded that he attempted to speak to the crowd, declaring his innocence and asking for fairness. But before he could finish, drums rolled to drown out his words. Seconds later, the blade fell, and his head was lifted high for the masses to see. For many Parisians, it was a moment of triumph, the ultimate proof that no one was above the revolution. The haunting aspect of Louis XV's death lies in the sheer magnitude of its symbolism. His execution set the stage for the Reign of Terror, when thousands more would meet the same fate. His fall was not simply the end of a king, it was the shattering of an entire world order. Among the cruelest forms of execution in antiquity was Rome's damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts. This punishment was reserved for criminals, slaves, and enemies of the state, who were thrown into arenas to be torn apart by wild animals for the entertainment of the masses. Lions, leopards, and bears were commonly used, creating a grotesque spectacle of blood and fear. Sometimes they were forced to fight armed gladiators, or made to reenact mythological scenes that ended in their inevitable deaths. The audience cheered as human lives were extinguished in savage displays, treating death as mere amusement. What makes damnatio ad bestias so chilling is the normalization of cruelty. These executions weren't carried out in secret. They were celebrated as public festivals. Entire families came to watch, turning human suffering into a social event. For the victims, death was slow, violent, and inescapable. The practice serves as one of history's starkest reminders of how societies can dehumanize individuals. To Rome, these victims were not people. They were props in a deadly show, their suffering a demonstration of the empire's power over life and death. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed on February 8, 1587, after nearly 2 decades of imprisonment in England. Cousin to Queen Elizabeth I, Mary was accused of plotting to assassinate Elizabeth and claim the English throne, though evidence of her direct involvement in the so-called Babington plot remains debated. Elizabeth ultimately signed her death warrant, sealing Mary's fate. The execution was staged at Fotheringhay Castle before witnesses to emphasize its legitimacy. Mary's death was gruesome and far from swift. Dressed in crimson, the Catholic color of martyrdom, she approached the scaffold with composure. Her final prayers echoed through the hall before the axe fell. Yet the first strike missed her neck, striking the back of her head. Her execution sent shockwaves across Europe, especially in Catholic nations, who saw Mary as a martyr persecuted by Protestant England. It tarnished her image as a reluctant executioner and ignited international outrage. Queen of Scots' execution was more than just a royal execution. It was a political earthquake. It remains haunting for its brutality, its spectacle, and the tragic image of a queen turned into a martyr before the eyes of the world. The invention of the gas chamber in the 20th century marked one of the most chilling advances in capital punishment. First introduced in Nevada in 1921, it was promoted as a more humane alternative to hanging or the electric chair. The condemned would be sealed in an airtight chamber as cyanide pellets dropped into acid, releasing a deadly cloud of gas. In theory, death was supposed to be quick and painless. In reality, it was often prolonged and agonizing. Eyewitnesses reported scenes of convulsions, desperate gasping, and horrific struggles as prisoners inhaled the toxic fumes. Some executions stretched on for minutes, leaving lasting trauma for both the victims and the witnesses. The method was soon adopted in other U.S. states, becoming a symbol of modernized execution. Courts questioned whether the gas chamber violated constitutional bans on cruel and unusual punishment. In 1996, a U.S. federal court declared it unconstitutional in California, citing the extreme suffering it caused. Gradually, lethal injection replaced it as the primary method of execution across the country. Today, the gas chamber remains a haunting chapter in the history of death penalties. The imagery of prisoners suffocating within glass walls continues to symbolize the grim reality of state-sanctioned death. Ernesto Che Guevara, the Argentine revolutionary who became an icon of Marxist movements, met his end by firing squad in Bolivia on October 9, 1967. After helping lead the Cuban Revolution alongside Fidel Castro, Che sought to ignite similar uprisings across Latin America. His guerrilla campaign in Bolivia, however, collapsed after months of hardship, betrayal, and relentless pursuit by Bolivian forces aided by the CIA. Captured on October 8, Che was held in a small schoolhouse in the village of La Higuera. He reportedly told his captors, "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." The next day, Bolivian soldiers executed him by firing squad. His body was displayed publicly to prove his death, before being buried in an unmarked grave to prevent his followers from creating a shrine. The execution of Che Guevara quickly transcended its immediate context. For his enemies, it was the elimination of a dangerous insurgent. For his supporters, it transformed him into a martyr of revolution. What makes this execution haunting is not only the brutality of his death, but the power of his legacy. The firing squad sought to silence Che, yet instead, they ensured his immortality. His defiance in the face of death continues to echo, making his execution one of the most notorious in modern history. These death penalties still echo through history. Which one do you think was the most haunting? Drop your thoughts in the comments and hit that subscribe button for more history's darkest stories explained.